Yo kids, what's happening? Got a special episode for you today. This one is going to be about the CIA, and we're going to work from three different texts. We've got Miles Copeland's Beyond Cloak and Dagger, Miles Copeland's Game of Nations, and then a little book called Legacy of Ashes by Tim Weiner, the history of the CIA. And in that book, we're going to cover a certain cast of characters that gets the party started, because when you're studying CIA history, it's important to know the different historical personages that shaped the agency. And so we're going to start with Miles Copeland's take, and we're going to begin with his book Beyond Cloak and Dagger. And so we'll cover basically the introduction for that one. I've got some notes on it, and I'll don my boomer glasses here so I can actually see what I'm reading. So hopefully this will get me through. I went from like Superman to like Clark Kent. So we're going through the CIA, folks, so buckle up. So Miles Copeland, Beyond Cloak and Dagger, starts out with a retired senior CIA officer, Miles Copeland, talking about the early days of the CIA as he experienced it. Now, first he makes a sort of explanation for why he's able to legally talk about the mechanics of their work, and how a good understanding of the nuts and bolts of the agency can benefit the average layman. Now, he was part of the development process of the agency. He saw it from the days of the Corps of Intelligence Police into the OSS and on into the days of the CIA. Presumably, he knew all the key players. Now, who are the key players of the early days? Well, a few names which were thrown around in this book, Tim Weiner's book, and also in Perloff's book on the CFR, being the Council on Foreign Relations. You get George Marshall, George Kennan, James Burns, Dean Acheson, James Forrestal, William Colby, General John Magruder, directors William Rayborn and Alan Dulles, Hoyt Vandenberg, and Roscoe Hillicuter, Lyman Kirkpatrick, Richard Helms, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. He talks about correspondences with Philip Agee and Stephen Penrose. Now, that sounds like a lot of people, and we will go through all of them at some point. But in order to not bore you with the specific details, we'll move on with the rest of the introduction. There is a host of pseudonymous characters as well as the known names, because sometimes we use code names, and you'll encounter characters like Mother, Fisherman, Jojo, and Kingfish. Now, he himself went by the name Major Lincoln at one time, which almost got him killed when another agent accidentally gave up his name as a ruse to confuse a disingenuous journalist. Now, I don't know for sure that he actually knew all of these people, but none of it would surprise me. Anyway, So starting at the beginning, he claims to give an authoritative and balanced view of the agency from the inside, intended to be understood by those of us who must view it from the outside. Many books about the CIA exist. Victor Marchetti's The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, Tim Weiner's Legacy of Ashes, which we're going to go through a little bit of that today, Philip Aggie's Inside the Company, Charles Ashman, and many others. Now, I'll provide a relatively complete list at some point. Miles Copeland has written several books, including this one, Beyond Cloak and Dagger. Without Cloak or Dagger is the name of another book. Game of Nations, we'll get started on that. Game Player, and possibly others. Of course, we all know Miles Copeland is the father of Stuart Copeland, the drummer from the Police. So, British intelligence is much more restrictive and vindictive against writers publishing their secrets. Many writers and publishers in the UK would have been jailed had they exposed this level of detail in their operations. Of course, Americans are less known for their discretion. Miles Copeland attempts to impart to the American audience what our clandestine services are all about. This so we can understand and judge their actions against a backdrop of history and view the CIA in its proper perspective. And according to a colleague, Beyond Cloak and Dagger is the first and possibly the last truly authoritative book about the CIA ever written. Fears by the agency of secrets being leaked, in addition to congressional inquiries, are bound to result in stricter controls on government employees and more compartmentalization. As for our government's tolerance of such exposés, compared to the time it was written, I would say they would be much less tolerant today. Back then, the agency was less in a position to enact lawfare against their dissident members who were letting out their secrets. Of course, it had to be done artfully, with the intention of informing the American public, rather than handing national secrets straight to our enemies. So, in many ways, we stand naked to our enemies. Disgruntled civil servants can expose our vulnerabilities at any time. Today, the American public is viewed more as the enemy. But at that time, as lawyers for the agency quickly found out, after they tried to stop Marchetti from publishing his book, legions of hungry lawyers would come out of the woodwork, ready to jump on any opportunity to protect civil liberties. But today, they just throw those lawyers in prison as well. Copeland playfully states that his book lets out 10 times as many secrets as Marchetti's. He says the result of all the leaking is that the public sphere is flooded with allegations concerning the agency's doings, but is given no background against which to judge them. Much like Carroll Quigley, in his attitude regarding the Royal Society's desire to keep its existence and operations a secret, Miles Copeland thought that the intelligence community and the country as a whole could benefit from an expose on the business of clandestine intelligence. He wanted to give the reader a sense of what information is true about the agency and which is false, and also to clear any misconceptions and misinterpretations about the truth, which has been told about the agency, and to give the public a basic understanding about what the agency is supposed to do. For example, editorialists were horrified at the prospect that CIA Director William Colby admitted to a senator that the CIA had at least talked about the possibility of committing an assassination, even if they hadn't actually done it. But sometimes the alternative course of action can be even more unthinkable. Another example of how these people freak out is their reaction to the idea of the agency, using our control over food resources as a tool in their negotiating kit when it comes to dealing with other countries. Incidentally, he says, these considerations didn't always originate with CIA representatives, but sometimes representatives of other agencies, departments, and even the president himself. However, Copeland claims the book is not a defense of the CIA. Still, most of the info for the book came out of interviews he conducted with a wide range of agency employees and retired alumni, some of whom he personally trained. He says he had no official help from the agency and paid only one visit to Langley in connection with it. Some senior officials have expressed disapproval of the book. And, he says, contrary to the opinions of the agency's most vociferous critics, their leadership is actually quite weak, their organization a mess, and it's filled with careerists who are more concerned with avoiding doing wrong than trying to do right. He also wanted to show that many of the snafus for which the agency has caught the blame, such as the overthrow of the Chilean government, the spying on tens of thousands of Americans, and the allegations of assassination attempts of foreign politicos, are not the result of the agency's strengths, but of its weaknesses. Miles Copeland claims that his books present a comprehensive statement of what the agency's clandestine services are up against. Marchetti's book gives an idea of what can go wrong from time to time in the agency. Beyond Cloak and Dagger illustrates why some mistakes are inevitable, and that normally the agency's operations do not go wrong and therefore go unreported, and that the security of our country owes more to this fact than to the implied threat of military action. So we'll end Beyond Cloak and Dagger here for now. That's just the introduction. So we'll move on to Game of Nations, also by Miles Copeland. And we'll do the introduction of that as well. So, much like the case study type of expose, which is given by Miles Copeland throughout the body of his book Beyond Cloak and Dagger, using several cases to illustrate particular aspects of the workings of the CIA. Game of Nations, more or less, as far as I can tell, I haven't read the entire book, deals with a singular case in exposing the way in which international relations are dealt with in crypto-diplomatic fashion. F. Scott Fitzgerald was inspired by Emily Post's Etiquette to write a play wherein a dramatic conflict would arise from stalemates between gentle people all trying to do the right thing. The conflict would be resolved only by a rogue who would bound onto the scene by behavior which is totally outlawed by the tenets of Post's Etiquette. In diplomacy, the situation is common where an impasse arises between governments, each holding to its position on grounds of high principle and diplomatic propriety. Copeland introduces the character of the guest no one invites again as the one who burrows under the strictures in order to break the deadlock, simultaneously saving all the faces. He gives a few examples of historical outcomes which remain mysterious in the public view due to editorial discretion, namely, the Suez Base Dispute of 1954. What caused the British and the Egyptians to come off of their mutual stalemate? The fall of Mossadegh in Iran. What brought that about? The Lebanese Civil War in 1958. How did the Nasserists wind up on top, right under the noses of the U.S. Marines? Why didn't Nasser engage in war with Israel when he had favorable opportunities, but then did engage in 1967 when he was least prepared? Historians tend to leave these questions unexplained, usually when the backstory is denied to them. Diplomats who were involved tend not to spill the facts in their memoirs, partly from security considerations, but also they don't want to disrupt the general citizen's prior worldview about how these matters are conducted. Again, this book, Game of Nations, like that other book, Beyond Cloak and Dagger, garnered criticism from colleagues about letting out information best kept under the rug that subverts people's view of government, which would be better left unchallenged. So, Miles Copeland liked to expose all that and show how the sausage is made, so to speak. He argues that intelligent citizens take little comfort in the narrow view that statesmanship and government decisions are made by these moralistic ideologues dedicated to doing the right thing by the popular consensus of the people and reacting in shocked surprise when the Soviets lie to us. He believed that most intelligent citizens would be relieved to know that there was not a man in the White House games room who was capable of shocked surprise at any amoral action by our enemies. Our statesmen are not the Pollyannas they try and appear to be. They would not be in the position they are in if they were not fully aware of what a general amoral world we live in. They get daily confirmation of this via the daily intelligence summaries. In addition, Miles Copeland felt people should be educated about their government and how it works. And he believed that just as likely, people would have confidence in their government, knowing the whole story. And also, don't trust what our leaders say in their autobiographies. Our national leaders are neither supermen nor saints. And as individuals, they are usually reluctant to make decisions about anything. But organizations work differently, so we can retain some confidence. The key participants in top-level government meetings where major decisions are made are there as heads of large departments, having at their disposal every means for determining the truth of a problem and for weighing all the means of solving it. These means are impersonal, objective, and of proved effectiveness. With the analyses that these means present, our officials have remarkable little discretionary leeway. Intelligence on foreign affairs identifies dangers and problems and indicates the variety of possible safeguards and solutions. Intelligence on domestic affairs tells which of these safeguards and solutions are publicly acceptable. The job of our top decision makers is to match the two. Sometimes they are utterly irreconcilable. Sometimes a charismatic president can tip the scale of domestic public sentiment. But this is not usually possible on the foreign side. But sometimes an only solution is not accepted domestically, and this is a liability they must take. But in an instance where national survival is at stake, crypto diplomacy steps in. While our citizens may take pride in the facade of high morality that our nation presents, they can also rest assured, knowing that behind this facade, we are capable of being just as devious and cunning as our adversaries. We do believe in honesty, not on its moral principle, but just because, as Ben Franklin would say, it's the best policy. A policy, by definition, is a standard solution to a constantly recurring problem, and not an inviolable law. When we choose to violate our policies, we find means outside the normal machinery of government. Which policies have we violated? Well, being truthful in our diplomacy. Also, not interfering with the internal affairs of a sovereign nation. And what means has our government used outside the norm? Well, it defines a problem, then releases forces which can affect a solution, and then disclaim any responsibility for what follows. I'm pretty sure we can think of an instance in the past 4 years when they've done this. These forces come into conflict with comparable forces of other governments. All of these forces combined share the same problems of moral facade, and a game of nations results. And the game of nations is what this book is all about. That's why it's called the Game of Nations. It concentrates on Egypt because that's where Miles Copeland was working as the guest no one invites again. And he was directly involved in much of the crypto diplomacy that accounts for the apparently illogical behavior of Middle Eastern leaders dealing with the West, and of Western diplomats dealing with the Middle Eastern governments. The book is a case history. It reveals general truths about the relations between the great powers and the small powers. These small powers, using techniques such as those of Egypt's President Nasser, are able to gain international influence out of all proportion with their inherent strength, and even to win diplomatic victories over one or another of the great powers. Through a series of faulty misunderstandings, our government would attempt to use a system for dealing with problems by ordinary means and fail miserably, i.e., mistakes our government made in dealing with President Nasser. So, this is a personal account of Miles Copeland's own experiences, and his objective here is to acquaint readers with an aspect of our government's handling of foreign affairs, which is often the most decisive and for the most part unknown to the public. The only omitted material is the top secret information, except where it has already leaked through spies or journalists. He did not withhold anything out of loyalty to the cabal, as he called it. Okay? So, well, in this one here, we'll get into the meat and potatoes of these books on the next round. We just pretty much went through the introductions. And so now we'll go through a little bit of Tim Weiner's Legacy of Ashes, a history of the CIA. Okay, so we're going to start with a cast of characters. And I'll begin with how they were described in the beginning of the book, Legacy of Ashes, as these characters arose. And the reason I'm going to do this is because as you're reading Legacy of Ashes, it's really easy to lose track of who these people are. And it's really best if while they're describing the people, you actually kind of look them up, do like a Google image search or something, just to see what they look like. And I'll probably insert some slides of photographs of some of these people as I find them. And so I'll begin with the book's description of them, and then I'll go into some of the Wikipedia stuff, because there's Wikipedia information about some of these people that goes beyond just what's described in the book, because the book has its own objective, and Wikipedia usually gives a pretty broad overview, of each of these characters. And these are real people. So we'll start with William Donovan, or Bill Donovan, key figure in the CIA. Okay, and this one, I'm not going to do the Wikipedia on all of them, but I will on Bill Donovan because he's important. So Bill Donovan was a commander of the OSS, or you could say the commander of the OSS, which is the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. He wanted to build a peacetime Central Intelligence Service. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor for heroism in France in World War I. Also received the Distinguished Service Cross, Distinguished Service Medal, National Security Medal, Silver Star, Purple Heart, as well as decorations from a number of other nations for his services during both World Wars. He had a bad reputation for recklessness. He had gotten a lot of men killed. Failed to convince Truman to back his proposal to create the CIA after FDR died. He was fired by Truman in 1945. And so this is the information I've gleaned from the first part of the book, with the exception of some of the decorations which he won. And I got that out of Wikipedia. And we'll go into the Wikipedia right here. So what does Wikipedia have to say about Bill Donovan? So he was born in 1883, died in 1959, a soldier, a lawyer, an intelligence officer, and a diplomat. He was regarded as the founding father of the CIA. A statue of him stands in the lobby at headquarters in Langley. From his father, Timothy, he was instilled with the values of toughness, duty, and honor to country and clan. Donovan attended St. Joseph's Collegiate Institute, a Catholic institution at which he played football, acted in plays, and won an award for oratory. He went on to Niagara University, where he undertook a pre-law major. He considered going into the priesthood, but decided he wasn't good enough to be a priest. He won another oratorical contest with a speech warning of corrupt anti-Christian forces that threatened the United States. Funny how he later joined and led those very forces. He eventually transferred to Columbia University, where he considered changing religions. He joined a fraternity and won several more awards, including Most Modest of his class of 1905. He earned his BA and spent 2 years at Columbia Law School and was classmates with FDR. After returning to Buffalo, he joined a respected law firm and eventually opened his own firm. He later joined the New York National Guard. He studied military strategy and combat tactics. He continued to take acting courses before finally getting married to an heiress. In 1916, he spent several months in Berlin on behalf of the Rockefeller Foundation, seeking to persuade the governments of Britain and Germany to allow the shipment of food and clothing into Belgium, Serbia, and Poland. Okay, so this one's getting a little bit long, but he is an important figure. Later that year, at the behest of the State Department, he returned to the U.S. and led a cavalry troop to the Texas border in a campaign against Pancho Villa. He joined the 59 Fighting Irish Regiment and entered World War I. He served in France and was wounded. He earned the name Wild Bill through his remarkable endurance compared to the younger soldiers. After the armistice of 1918, he remained in Europe as part of the occupation. Upon returning to New York, now a colonel, he was discussed as a candidate for governor, but he turned it down in order to return to practicing law. He did an intelligence mission to Japan, China, and Korea, went on alone to Siberia during the Russian Civil War. He took an extensive trip to Europe, where he did business under the auspices of J.P. Morgan and gathered intelligence about international communism. From 1922 to 1924, he served as U.S. Attorney for the Western District of New York. He was an energetic enforcer of prohibition. In 1923, he and his agents raided the Saturn Club, of which Donovan himself was a member. And this pissed a lot of people off, including his own wife. In 1924, Calvin Coolidge appointed Bill Donovan as assistant to Attorney General Harlan Stone, in charge of the criminal division. He had a frictious relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, briefly one of his underlings. Stone went to the Supreme Court, was replaced by John Sargent, whom Donovan sometimes substituted for in his absence. Then more talk about him becoming New York governor. Herbert Hoover wanted to make him AG, but instead offered him governorship of the Philippines, which he turned down. He resigned from the DOJ in 1929, moved to New York City, and opened another law firm. Finally, ran for New York governorship in 1932, but lost to Herbert Lehman. Okay, so I'll end Bill Donovan here. Now, Walter Bedell Smith. This one's a little shorter, I promise. Walter Bedell Smith was Chief of Staff to Eisenhower in World War II. He was the American ambassador in Moscow from 1946 through 1948. Later, Director of Central Intelligence in 1950. Regularly worked himself beyond exhaustion. He personally accepted the Nazi surrender that ended the war, and he had personally met with Stalin. Okay, so that's what I've gathered from where I'm at in the book, which is not very far into the book. Let's see, what does Wikipedia have to say about old Walter Bedell Smith? Born in 1895, died in 1961, served with American Expeditionary Forces in World War I, often briefed FDR on strategic matters, was involved in negotiating the armistice between Italy and the Allies in World War II. He reorganized the CIA and made it into the arm of the government primarily responsible for covert operations. He left the CIA in 1953 to become Undersecretary of State. He retired from the State Department in 1954, continued to serve the Eisenhower administration until he retired shortly before he died in 1961. So, not a whole lot to see here with Walter Bedell Smith. Now, we'll go into a little longer one here, and we're going to talk about Allen Dulles. Allen W. Dulles. an important figure. Was born in not even 19. He was born in 1893 in New York. Donovan's, and he's still alive. No, he's not really. He'd be fucking old. So Donovan's star-ranking officer in the OSS in Germany. As OSS chief in Switzerland, he built his reputation as an American master spy. He was regarded by the Republican Party leadership as the director of Central Intelligence in exile. He secretly wanted to resurrect the wartime covert operations of the OSS. He was an on and off lawyer at Sullivan and Cromwell in New York, where his brother John Foster was a partner. He had been a junior diplomat after World War I and a Wall Street lawyer in the Depression. So that's the scoop on him from the first few chapters of the book. Now some Wikipedia on Mr. Allen Dulles. He died in 1969. He was the first civilian director of Central Intelligence. He oversaw the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat, the Lockheed U-2 aircraft program, the MK-Ultra mind control program, and the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was fired by JFK over the Bay of Pigs fiasco. He was a member of the Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination of JFK. Nothing to see here. His brother, John Foster, was Secretary of State under Eisenhower. Dulles International Airport was named after him. And he was the son of a Presbyterian minister. And so was his brother. 5 years younger than John Foster, Allen was. His maternal grandfather, John W. Foster, was Secretary of State under Benjamin Harrison. His uncle by marriage was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. So this Secretary of State thing seems to be genetic. He graduated from Princeton, and he entered the diplomatic service in 1916. His son, Allen Macy Dulles II, was wounded and permanently disabled in the Korean War, and he allowed his son to be mercilessly experimented on by government scientists. According to his wife Eleanor, he had at least 100 extramarital affairs. Damn, big baller, huh? So, needless to say, a complete and total psychopath. One thing he did y'all might like, he helped expose the as a forgery along with The Times, a Rhodes Milner publication, then unsuccessfully attempted to persuade the U.S. State Department to publicly denounce the forgery. Early in his career, he was initially assigned to Vienna, but was transferred to Bern, Switzerland, shortly before the U.S. entered World War I. Later in life, Dulles said he had been telephoned by Vladimir Lenin seeking a meeting with the American Embassy on April 8, 1917, the day before Lenin left Switzerland to travel to St. Petersburg. After recovering from the Spanish flu, Allen Dulles was assigned to the American delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, alongside his brother. From 1922 to 1926, he served as chief of the Near East Division in the State Department. He got his law degree in 1926, became a director of the Council on Foreign Relations in 1927, the first new director since the Council's founding in 1921. He was the council's secretary from 1933 to 1944, and its president from 1946 to 1950. So he was active in the CFR for at least 23 years. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, he served as legal advisor to the delegations on arms limitation at the League of Nations. He met with Tiny Mustache Man and Mussolini. He met with Tiny Mustache Man again in 1933. Afterwards, he wrote his brother Foster and told him that conditions under Tiny Mustache Man's regime were not as bad as an alarmist friend had indicated. After meeting with Joseph Goebbels, Dulles stated he was impressed with him. Not to downplay any of this, but this was rather early in the regime. In 1935, Dulles returned from a business trip concerned by the Nazi treatment of German Jews, and despite his brother's objections, led a movement within their law firm to close their Berlin office. The effort was successful, and the firm ceased to conduct business in Nazi Germany. As the Republican Party began to divide into isolationist and interventionist factions, Allen sided with the interventionists and ran unsuccessfully for Congress in 1938. He did help some German Jews escape to the United States from Nazi Germany. Okay, so John Foster Dulles, brother of Allen, the Republican Party's principal foreign policy spokesman, regarded by the Republican Party leadership as the Shadow Secretary of State, also a CFR member. Okay, so that's all we really have on him for right now. Okay, so David K.E. Bruce was Bill Donovan's right-hand man, later ambassador to France, Germany, and England. Richard Park Jr. was FDR's chief White House military aide. He conducted an investigation into wartime operations of the OSS and submitted a damning report to the president. Clayton Bissell was Assistant Chief of Staff for Military Intelligence. William J. Casey was an OSS officer and future Director of Central Intelligence. Gerald Miller was CIA's Covert Military Operations Chief for Western Europe in the 1950s. Okay, Richard Helms. Here's another important figure, but I won't go into his Wikipedia article here. Richard Helms was Dulles' favorite lieutenant in 1945. He tried to spy on the Soviets. He interviewed Tiny Mustache Man at the 1932 Olympics. He sought out Nazi scientists for use by the U.S. so as not for the USSR. He tried to recruit German police and politicians to establish spy networks. He sought to know the enemy through secret intelligence and espionage. He was in charge of espionage in Germany, Austria, Poland, etc., and pumped a lot of money into bad intelligence. Also was a CFR member. John Magruder was Donovan's deputy. He joined the Army in 1910, and he pulled strings in the Pentagon to salvage what was left of the OSS as the Strategic Services Unit. Okay, now James Forrestal was Secretary of the Navy. He was George Kennan's political patron and disseminated George Kennan's writings to many military officers. He was the first Secretary of Defense and a Wall Street wonder boy. CFR member. he stunned the establishment with overtly anti-communist activities. His initiative was largely responsible for preventing a communist takeover in Italy in 1948. Understanding the true intentions of the establishment regarding communism, he decided to fight them on it and counteract communism within the government. And with his planned acquisition of the New York Sun as a means of exposing some of the traitors in Washington, he was fired by Truman and put into a psychiatric hospital where he was drugged and held incommunicado for several weeks. His diaries were confiscated, and before he could be released, he was suicided, falling from a 16th-story window with the cord of his bathrobe tied around his neck. Frank Wisner wanted to change the world through covert action and secret warfare. He was a corporate lawyer, an OSS station chief in Bucharest, Romania in 1944. He saw the Russians infiltrate his inner circle of allies and take control of Bucharest, sending thousands of Romanians to the gulags. He returned to OSS headquarters in Germany. He flew with Richard Helms to Washington in 1945. He returned temporarily to his law firm in New York. Then, in 1946, returned to Washington to work at the State Department. He hosted weekly dinners with other old boys, David Bruce, Chip Bolin, Robert Lovett, Dean Acheson, and Hoyt Vandenberg, planning future foreign policy. Okay, so what does Wikipedia have to say about Frank Wisner? He was born in 1909, died in 1965. He was one of the founding officers of the CIA, played a major role in CIA operations throughout the 1950s. He began his career in the OSS during World War II. After the war, he headed the Office of Policy Coordination, one of the OSS successor organizations. After the war, he headed the Office of Policy Coordination, one of the OSS successor organizations, from 1948 to 1950. In 1950, the OPC was placed under the CIA and renamed the Directorate of Plans. First headed by Allen Dulles, Wisner succeeded Dulles in 1951 when Dulles was named Director of Central Intelligence. Wisner remained as Deputy Director of Plans until 1958, playing an important role in the history of the CIA. He suffered a breakdown in 1958 and retired from the agency in 1962. He committed suicide in 1965. He had been educated at the University of Virginia, had connections to the Seven Society, graduated from the University of Virginia School of Law in 1934. He worked as a Wall Street lawyer as well. In 1941, 6 months before the Pearl Harbor attack, he enlisted in the Navy. He worked in the Navy Censor's Office before transferring to the OSS in 1943. First stationed in Cairo, then spent 3 months in Istanbul as head of Secret Intelligence Branch. In 1944, became head of OSS in Bucharest, Romania, just as Romania joined the Allies and declared war on the Axis. Wisner left Bucharest in 1945. He was in Wiesbaden, Germany from 1945 to 1946. I used to live there. I only missed him by 31 years. But after that, he returned to practicing law. During World War II, he became friends with Philip and Catherine Graham, who became publishers of the Washington Post. So, his CIA career, he was recruited in 1947 by Dean Acheson to join the State Department and become the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for occupied areas. In 1948, the National Security Council approved NSC 10-2, which created the Office of Special Projects. The office was formally established that year, but renamed the Office of Policy Coordination. He led the OPC as Assistant Director, and he was down with OPP. The OPC initially received services from the CIA. I'm sorry. The OPC initially received services from the CIA, but was unaccountable to the State Department. According to his secret charter, the OPC's responsibilities include propaganda, economic warfare, preventive direct action, including sabotage, anti-sabotage, demolition, and evacuation procedures. Subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance groups, guerrillas, and refugee liberation groups, and support of indigenous anti-communist elements in threatened countries of the free world. In 1951, he succeeded Allen Dulles and became the second Deputy Director of Plans, with Richard Helms as his Chief of Operations. He was instrumental in supporting pro-American forces that toppled Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 and Jacobo Guzman in Guatemala in 1954. He was also involved in a project that brought former NAZIs into the United States and granted them citizenship after they played a key role in helping wage guerrilla warfare in Soviet-occupied Europe. These were former Belarus brigade leaders, and the intelligence agencies protected them from exposure for decades. He worked closely with British Soviet spy Kim Philby. He was involved in establishing the Lockheed U-2 spy plane program run by Richard Bissell Jr. After his mental breakdown, he was diagnosed as manic depressive and received electroshock therapy. Bissell replaced him as Deputy Director of Plans. After a lengthy recovery, Wisner became chief of the CIA's London station. In 1961, he was ordered to organize CIA activities in British Guyana. He retired in 1962. Okay, I'll move on without any more information from Wikipedia from here on. This program is going to be long enough, as it is. I'm feeling it. I'm feeling it. So, Bill Quinn was General Magruder's executive officer at the Strategic Services Unit. Sherman Kent was a founding father of CIA's Directorate of Intelligence. Sidney Sowers was a Democrat from Missouri. He was a wealthy businessman who made his money in life insurance and Piggly Wiggly supermarket shops. Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence. That's a wide range of skills right there. He had served on a post-war commission, studying the future of intelligence created by James Forrestal. First Director of the short-lived Central Intelligence Group. Then, later an advisor to President Truman. Now, George Kennan. George Kennan schooled Bedell Smith at the American Embassy in Moscow. He was known as the great criminologist in the American government. He issued the famous long telegram from Moscow outlining the Soviet threat. Much respected by Frank Wisner and very influential in intelligence circles. He drew up the initial plan for the newly named Cold War. His ideas gave rise to A. the Truman Doctrine, a political warning to Russia to halt its subversion of foreign nations, and B. the Marshall Plan, a global force for American influence against communism, and C. the Central Intelligence Agency, a clandestine service. In 1947, he sent James Forrestal a paper calling for the establishment of a guerrilla warfare corps. Together, they set the clandestine service in motion. He suggested a foreign policy council of wise men, akin to the Supreme Court. Now, Hoyt Vandenberg was the second director of Central Intelligence, a pilot in the war, created the Office of Special Operations. He changed the mission of Central Intelligence in 1946 to cut off the Red Army's supply lines in Romania and ordered the organization of the National Peasant Party as an underground resistance force. He was the nephew to Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg. And who was Arthur Vandenberg? A Republican senator in 1947, chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations. Uncle to Hoyt Vandenberg. Urged President Truman to make a speech before Congress to drum up funds to aid Greece against the communists, since Britain could no longer afford to keep paying, effectively fear-mongering the public and instating the Truman Doctrine, which stated that any enemy of the U.S. attacking any country was an attack on the U.S. Sounds familiar. Lawrence Houston was General Counsel for Central Intelligence from 1946 to 1972. He had said in the first days of the CIA that the agency had no legal authority to conduct covert action without the express consent of Congress. Thomas R. Hall, former OSS in the Balkans, organized the National Peasants' Party, the NPP, in Romania with Ira Hamilton. David Bruce, an OSS veteran turned American ambassador in Paris. Chip Bolin, counsel to Secretary of State, later ambassador to Moscow. Dean Acheson, Secretary of State, 1947. George Marshall, Chief of the U.S. Army in World War II, later Secretary of State. He placed George Kennan in charge of the State Department's policy planning staff. With Robert Lovett, testified before Congress about the need for the Marshall Plan. Theodore Menakatide, Ira Hamilton's guide in Romania, had been a sergeant on the intelligence staff of the Romanian army and then worked at an American military mission. Translator by day, spy by night. He took Ira Hamilton and Thomas Hall to meet the National Peasant Party leaders and received a life sentence imprisonment for his troubles. He was convicted in absentia. Robert Lovett was Undersecretary of State with George Marshall, testified before Congress about the need for the Marshall Plan, and he loved it. George J. Tenet was Director of Central Intelligence in 1997. Roscoe Hillicutter, also called Hilly, was third director of Central Intelligence, sworn in May of 1947, was successor to Hoyt Vandenberg, what a Dutchman, sought to limit the CIA's overseas missions to the gathering of intelligence. He failed. The real decisions were made over breakfast at Secretary of Defense James Forrestal's house. So, according to Wikipedia, I know I said I wasn't going to do any more Wikipedia. I lied. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and Senator Joseph McCarthy succeeded in forcing him to dismiss longtime staffer Carmel Offee in 1950 for homosexuality, despite Frank Wisner's objections. Donald Galloway was commander of the CIA's Office of Special Operations. Called Wrong Way Galloway, he reached the apex of his talent as a West Point cavalry officer, teaching equestrian etiquette to cadets. So he was kind of like Niedermeyer from Animal House. He feed the horse a carrot with his mouth. Stephen Penrose, Wrong Way Galloway's deputy, who had run the Middle East Division of the OSS. He resigned in frustration from the Galloway appointment. Okay, so what was the National Security Act of 1947? July 26th, by the way. 11 days after my birthday. So the National Security Act of 1947 created the Air Force as a separate service led by General Hoyt Vandenberg, a new National Security Council. It created the new office of Secretary of Defense. The first was James Forrestal, who was ordered to unify the American military. It also gave birth to the Central Intelligence Agency on September 18th, 1947. Now, this National Security Act of 1947 faced fierce opposition from within the Pentagon and the State Department, whose reports it was supposed to coordinate. No formal charter of congressionally approved funds would come to it for 2 more years. It survived on a subsistence fund maintained by a few members of Congress. The Act said nothing about secret operations overseas. It instructed the CIA to correlate, evaluate, and disseminate and masturbate intelligence and to perform functions related to intelligence affecting the national security. Covert action was supposed to occur under the authority of the National Security Council, that is, the President, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and the military chiefs. Okay, so we'll end that there. We don't actually go into the narrative at all of Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA by Tim Weiner. We just gave the cast of characters and a basic rundown of some of the major points of interest that we will encounter. And so the reason for all of this is that we familiarize ourselves, myself, with all the variables of Legacy of Ashes, because it's really hard to follow. And I'm going to start doing a little bit more of these casts of characters, of historical personages who are going to come up over and over again in some of this intelligence, espionage literature, and in some of the globalist literature that I'm going to go through as well. So I'm going to end it there for the day. This has been real fun. I've enjoyed this. But as usual, once I'm going for a considerable portion of time, my back starts hurting. I need to get a proper office. I'd like to keep this backdrop at some point, but I'd like to be sitting in an office chair. Maybe one day I'll have a studio. But for now, this is what we're dealing with. It's janky, but it's what I've got. So, I'm going to go now. You guys have a good day, and I'll see y'all later.